1492 guy. Let's look at some silly stuff. Silly stuff from 500 years ago that we deal with every day. Can you imagine that? The doctrine of discovery is not a very silly thing. That's from 500 years ago. We deal with that every day and none of us even knows about it. But these are things that we know all about. So let's say, for example, the pepper. There's the green pepper, the orange pepper, the red pepper, the yellow pepper, those kind of peppers. It comes from the nightshade family, same family as a tomato. Now that plant grew all around the world in the nightshade family, a deadly poison, as a matter of fact. Only the Indians of the Western Hemisphere turned that into a beautiful food to eat. That grew all over the world. This food contributions that they gave, this food wasn't growing out in the wild by any means, but it was developed on indigenous farms over thousands of years. Now, when they first fed the tomatoes to the Europeans, when they came, they cut off their hands. They thought they were trying to poison them. So, when peppers was first seen, that was chili peppers that were first experienced by some of the Spanish explorers, the conquistadors. So it was hot, and they called it peppers. When they very first tasted it, they called it peppers. And here we are, hundreds and hundreds of years later, still calling it pepper. It's got nothing to do with the other pepper that was from Asia that had a hot sort of an effect on the palate in their mouth. So there's an example of how not just Eurocentricity, but just how entrenched these things can really become. So that's one. Let's look at the term America. I won't go into too much detail because Amerigo Vespucci, he's covered in my 72-part video series. He's got one to himself. But he was mostly an adventurer, like a lot of the people who came to the Western Hemisphere. And the stories that he told about his explorations were always exaggerated, as many of the stories were at that time. The odds of them having something accurate about the indigenous were about equal to the odds of them having something about islands of sex nymphs and two-headed people and dragons and fictitious critters of all kinds. And that was what people in Europe who were fascinated with the Western Hemisphere and the people who lived here expected in their publications. And they were fascinated with the Western Hemisphere at that time. So Amerigo Vespucci was the most successful in terms of marketing his periodicals. And he also maybe had some publishers who were really good at embellishing, because they would not only take some of these ridiculous writings, but then they would embellish them as well too, and compete with each other because they wanted to sell their publications. So he might have linked up with one or two writers, which are publishers, who were particularly good at that type of thing. There was no authorship and no ownership of your material at that time. They could do whatever they wanted. And so a guy happened to be making a map who had been reading, his friend had been reading a series of these periodicals from Amerigo, and one guy happened to put it on one map one time, Land of Amerigo. And then somebody copied the map a little bit later, and one thing led to another. It was a series of flukes, really, that we ended up with America, North America, South America, United States of America, Americans. It's all over the place. The American Indian. So that's America, and we're going to get into that term next. The term Indian, American Indian. Now, I use the term Indian. And, of course, I'm rightfully so. I'm chastised for that, but particularly in Canada, where it's just not only politically incorrect, it's practically forbidden to use the term. Even though we're living with the Indian Act every day, we have the Indian Act. It's never gone away yet. Hopefully soon. The term Indians is still around. Now, I use it, and it's partly because I know it's not as offensive as people tend to think in the indigenous community. Yes, certainly, particularly in Canada, it can be. It's not a nice term. I use it interchangeably. Western Hemisphere Indigenous is highly superior to that. WHI, capital WHI, Western Hemisphere Indigenous. One term that encapsulates all of the 3,500 nations who lived up and down the Western Hemisphere from Tierra del Fuego to the North Pole, because they were one peoples. And that aspect of it gets lost. Yes, there were 3,500 peoples. There was thousands of languages. We don't know how many peoples or languages. The records were destroyed. But we do know there was a lot of rich cultures, but we do know that there was also a contiguousness to much of their culture, their foodstuffs, their spirituality, their attitudes. Each main area had their sort of attitudes and views and spiritualities in food. South America, Mesoamerica, North America, even the West Indies. But there was also some continuity to some of the technologies, particularly when you get into medical and food. And so that aspect of it is lost. Obviously, today we've got 35 countries spanning the North and South America and Central America. Those imaginary lines dominate everything in terms of studying, looking at history, in terms of our culture, in terms of modern day lifestyles and analysis, trying to do anything really. And that includes, if you happen to be in an indigenous community, traveling to other areas, linking up with other indigenous people on a physical level is actually in itself even an issue. So we deal with these imaginary lines today. So some of the terms, let's look at some of the terms. I'm in Canada, so First Nations is very well established, and as it should be. The term Indianism may be a little bit too forbidden until we get rid of the Indian Act. It's a good reminder, really, that we have that in some senses. But if you talk about the indigenous of the Western Hemisphere, if you use the term First Nations, that means Canadians. That means Canadian people north of the border. I don't want to send that message. I talk about the Western Hemisphere. I'm not talking about Canadian Indigenous. I'm talking about the Indigenous in the entire Western Hemisphere, and that's my message that I'm spreading. What was accomplished here prior to 1492. Okay, the term American Indian, which can be used to describe all of them as well, too. Native Americans is another one, but that sounds like people from the United States, and that's the difficulty with that one. Some of those types of terms, Native American, American Indian. If you'll see history of United States things being done, and they'll use those terms. But sometimes the terms are used for all of the indigenous of the Americas. And then the fact that we've got the Americas thrown in there. India itself is a joke because they were looking for India, and we have the word because it's related to India, and a big mistake like peppers. So that's a reason why Indians could someday just disappear, the word completely. But it'd be nice to have something shorter than Western Hemisphere Indigenous to use. Now, why not call them Indigenous? Excuse me. Well, Indigenous isn't just the Western Hemisphere. That's a term for all the Indigenous of the world. And there's Indigenous all over the place in Russia, Sweden, and of course places like Africa and India, China. There's displaced Indigenous people all over the world. A big bulk of them related to Europeans and the colonization and the stuff that we look at related to the Western Hemisphere in 1492, Columbus, and all the people that followed up on Columbus and all the mess that's gone on since then. But these displaced indigenous people worldwide, they have the exact same problems with mining and lumber and toxicity and moving and being pushed aside and being ignored and not supposed to be here. They're supposed to have been exterminated by now. So they're dealing with a situation where they're kind of in a limbo a lot of times. They're there, but they're sort of ignored. They weren't supposed to be there, and they live with that aspect of things, and they're pretty much ignored by the dominant culture. And so they have such common issues that they're linking up all around the world, not just the United States to Canada, not just people from Peru linking up with people with Ecuador who are linking up with people from Canada and the U.S. There's a lot of that going on, as it should. It's one of the most just activist aspects of our world that there is. And unfortunately, a lot of it is invisible. And so many things that were contributed are unrecognized, which is one of my main subjects. Not only that Indians and Europeans were all peers and co-equals, but that there's so many unrecognized contributions and things that they gave to the world, and that's sad that these things are so invisible, along with the history being invisible of how they got pushed aside and everything stolen from them. So the indigenous community, the displaced indigenous community in the world, is around 380 million people now, and becoming more and more of a force to be reckoned with. That is the third largest country in the world, by the way, 380 million people. So that's a lot of people. Anyway, I'd like to see capital W, capital H, capital I. It's not a great acronym, I guess, to say something, but until there's another short syllable word like Indians that brings up all of these aspects of what they did, it'll be difficult for me to want to just completely dump that term and say Western Hemisphere Indigenous every time. Because, as I mentioned, there is this contiguousness where the white man takes credit for anything that happened, any time, any place in history. They're right there like, well, look what we did. We thought all this up, and you should be thanking us for that. We want to have the indigenous in the Western Hemisphere to have some of that. They are a peoples that, and they can take credit in the same way. And that's a Ray Fadden kind of a concept, and I like that, to bring that forward. And so one word that encompasses all of the people, one short word that's already known, it's very tempting to use that, and I do use it. And sometimes I feel apologetic, but not completely. Not completely. There's a reason for that. So if you can come up with a good term, let me know. All right, so there we are. Peppers, America, and Indians. That's it for today. The 1492 guy signing off. Bye for now.